Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, welcome to this episode of The Situation with Michael Brown. This may be a little disjointed today, just to give you a heads up. I am I'm actually recording this on Monday the 20th, and the Wall Street Journal has just released the president's 171-page trial brief in support or in opposition to the impeachment proceedings that are going to start or that have started occurring in the United States Senate. And while I've briefly gone through all 171 pages, I want to focus on the issue about corruption in Ukraine, because I think that's where, well, let me back up a second. This whole idea about obstruction of Congress is absurd on its face. The President of the United States, every single president that I know of in my lifetime, at one time or another has either refused to cooperate with Congress, has refused to turn over documents, has refused to have witnesses come and testify before Congress, all because these two branches of government are separate but equal. And the executive branch enjoys something called executive privilege. Executive privilege, for those of you who haven't heard me discuss this before, let me just give you a real quick synopsis of what executive privilege is. In the executive branch, much like you have the attorney-client privilege, you have the doctor-patient privilege, you have the pastoral congregant privilege, you have this privilege called executive privilege in the executive branch that says the President of the United States needs to be able to freely and openly have discussions with his advisors before he makes a decision about something. Most of those discussions are called pre-decisional matters, and those pre-decisional matters are generally kept from public view because you don't want to have a chilling effect. You don't want advisors. For example, when I would give advice to President Bush about any particular matter, something about post 9/11, a disaster or disaster relief, or whatever the issue might be, the continuity of operations programs, the continuity of government programs, all those local secret black op programs that FEMA and DHS has. I wanted to make certain that I could give the president unvarnished advice, to tell him exactly what I thought, to have that debate back and forth about what my advice might be. And if I had to always be concerned that any pre-decisional discussions I had with the president would become public, that would make it more difficult for me, because I would think, okay, well, if I tell the president that, if we do X means that Congress might not like ABC, or that Congress might react this way or that way, that means that next time that I talk to the president, I have to be a little circumspect in what I say, because I don't necessarily want the people that I then have to go deal with on the Hill to know what I was saying about them, for example. So this whole idea of executive privilege has developed around the executive branch so that these pre-decisional matters can be protected from public disclosure. It also means that the president, if he doesn't want his advisors to testify on particular matters, that they can refuse to do so. And the president can invoke executive privilege. And then once the president invokes executive privilege, the courts then get to decide, is that a valid exercise? Is the exercise of executive privilege in these particular circumstances warranted? That's why we have three separate but equal branches of government. They all act as a check and balance on each other. So when it comes to this whole idea of obstruction of Congress, I just think that is absurd on its face. It's absurd on its face because the President of the United States should be allowed to have whatever discussions he wants and to be able to protect those from Congress. And if Congress doesn't like it, and in this particular matter, if these Democrats didn't like the president saying so-and-so cannot testify, go argue that in court. Take it to the district court in the District of Columbia. Let it go to the D.C. Court of Appeals. Let it eventually go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and let the U.S. Supreme Court decide whether or not that particular invocation of executive privilege was justified or not justified. So obstruction of Congress is just absurd on its face, because every president probably, I haven't done the historical analysis, but I would say probably every president in the history of the United States has at one time or another refused to cooperate with Congress. And if every time a president refuses to cooperate with Congress, that becomes some sort of obstruction that is an impeachable offense, then we really have reached peak stupidity. And we really have reached the point where impeachment then becomes this process. Well, if you just don't like what the president's doing, you can't remove him from office at the next election. You then go through an impeachment process to try to get him removed before the people can vote on whether or not they like what this president is doing or not. So the whole obstruction thing is just, well, let me just say it for the 15th time. It is absurd on its face. But I want to go to Ukraine for a minute. Well, I don't want to physically go to Ukraine, but I want to talk about Ukraine for a minute. And the reason I do is because there is so much out in the public domain about the president's refusal to release the aid being a violation of federal appropriation law. Not necessarily true. And in this case, the facts belie what the general accounting officer, the government accounting officer, whoever it was that put out that statement, really isn't telling you the entire truth. Let me read, but let's start with the very first part of the Ukraine issue. And that is that witnesses testified that the president had concerns about corruption in Ukraine. And all of those concerns predate his concerns about corruption in Ukraine predate Joe Biden even considering getting in the race, letting alone getting into the Democratic race. Here's what he says in his brief. Contrary to the bald assertion in the House Democrats' trial brief that, quote, before news of former Vice President Biden's candidacy broke, President Trump showed no interest in corruption in Ukraine, close quote, multiple witnesses testified that the president has long had concerns about this issue. Dr. Hill, for instance, testified that she, quote, thinks the president has actually quite publicly said that he was very skeptical about corruption in Ukraine. And in fact, he's not alone because everyone has expressed great concerns about corruption in Ukraine, close quote. Then he writes in the brief, similarly, Ambassador Yovanovitch testified that we all had concerns about corruption in Ukraine and even noted, now remember, this is the ambassador that was removed from her post in Ukraine, something which the president has the absolute right to do so. In the brief, they say this. Similarly, Ambassador Yovanovitch testified that we all had concerns about corruption in Ukraine and noted that President Trump delivered an anti-corruption message to former Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko in their first meeting in the White House on June 20, 2017, long before Joe Biden got in the race. National Security Council Senior Director Morrison, they write, confirmed that he, quote, was aware that President thought Ukraine had a corruption problem, as did many others familiar with Ukraine. The brief goes on to state, and Ms. Croft also heard the president raise the issue of corruption directly with then-President Poroshenko of Ukraine during a bilateral meeting at the UN General Assembly in September 2017. The brief says she also understood the president's concern that Ukraine is corrupt because she had been tasked and then retasked by then National Security Advisor General McMaster to write a paper to help McMaster make the case to the president in connection with prior security assistance. That is an incredibly important point. That means that long before politics entered into this, the president was expressing to his National Security Advisor about corruption, and that General McMaster was actually tasking people to put together briefings and documents to make the case to the president about corruption with regard to prior security assistance, not the security assistance that is in question now, but prior assistance. In the second part of Ukraine, the brief says this: President Trump has well-documented concerns regarding American taxpayers being forced to cover the cost of foreign aid while other countries refuse to pitch in. In fact, quote, another factor in the Foreign Affairs Review discussed by Undersecretary Hale over the Defense Department was, quote, the appropriate burden sharing. The president's 2018 budget, which would have been done back in 2017, discussed this precise issue. The budget proposes to reduce or end direct funding for international programs and organizations whose missions do not substantially advance U.S. foreign policy interests. The budget also renews attention on the appropriate U.S. share of international spending at the UN, the World Bank, and for many other global issues where the United States currently pays more than its fair share. Now, House Democrats wrongly claim that it was not until September that the hold on aid to Ukraine, for the first time, was attributed to the president's concern about other countries not contributing more to Ukraine, and that the president never ordered a review of burden sharing. Those statements are demonstrably false, and they go through and point out precisely in here why that is true. Mr. Morrison testified that he was well aware of the president's skeptical view on foreign aid generally and Ukrainian aid specifically. He has testified that the president was trying to scrutinize aid to make sure that taxpayers were getting their money's worth, and explained that the president, quote, was concerned that the United States seemed to bear the exclusive brunt of security assistance to Ukraine. He wanted to see the Europeans step up and contribute more security assistance. There is a June 24 email with the subject line, POTUS follow up, wherein a Department of Defense official relayed several questions from a meeting with the president, including, what do other NATO members spend to support Ukraine? Moreover, as discussed in other parts of the brief, the president personally raised the issue of burden sharing with the newly elected president, Zelensky, on July 25. Senator Ron Johnson similarly related that the president had shared concerns about burden sharing with him. He recounted an August 31 conversation in which President Trump discussed or described discussions that he would have with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. According to Senator Johnson, President Trump explained, Ron, I talked to Angela and asked her, why don't you fund these things? And she tells me, quote, because we know that you will. We're schmucks, Ron. We're not schmucks. Then Ambassador Taylor testified that when the vice president met with President Zelensky on September 1, the vice president reiterated that, quote, President Trump wanted the Europeans to do more to support Ukraine. So this predates all of the stuff about Joe Biden running for president. But let's talk about the pause. Remember, there's all of this controversy about the pause in the aid to Ukraine. The brief addresses that squarely on. In part 3 of the discussion, or in their trial brief about Ukraine, the president's lawyers write this: placing a temporary pause on foreign aid is not unusual. Indeed, the president has often paused, reevaluated, and in some cases even canceled foreign aid programs. And they give some examples. Of course, most people, most Americans, because the news media won't talk about this, never points these out. 1. In September 2019, the Trump administration announced that it was withholding more than $100 million in aid to Afghanistan over concerns about government corruption. In August of 2019, the president announced that the administration and Seoul were in talks to substantially increase South Korea's share of the expense of U.S. military support for South Korea. 3. In June, the president cut or paused more than $550 million in foreign aid to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala because those countries were not fairly sharing the burdens of stopping the mass migrations to the United States. Where are the Democrats on that? Why didn't they impeach him on that? Number 4, in or around June, the Trump administration temporarily paused $105 million in military aid to Lebanon The administration lifted the hold in December, with one official explaining that the administration continually reviews and thoroughly evaluates the effectiveness of all United States foreign assistance to ensure that funds go toward activities that further U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. Now, before I get to number 5, here's a parenthetical. That is precisely the job of the executive branch. The Congress authorizes and then appropriates money. They send that money over to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget can decide when, where, and how, unless it is very specifically and legally and tightly described exactly the who, what, where, when, how you're going to spend this money. The executive branch's duties under the Constitution is to faithfully execute the laws and to make sure that, I know it's to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but part of their job as being in the executive branch is to make sure that whatever the executive branch is doing, that they're doing it in the best interest of the taxpayers, and the president has the leeway to make these decisions. Then we get to number 5. In September of 2018, the administration canceled $300 million in military aid to Pakistan because Pakistan was not meeting its counterterrorism obligations. Undersecretary Hale, over at DOD, agreed that, quote, aid has been withheld from several countries across the globe for various reasons, and in some cases for reasons that are still unknown just in the past year. Dr. Hale explained that there was a freeze put on all kinds of aid and assistance because it was in the process at the time of an awful lot of reviews of foreign assistance. Dr. Hill added that in her experience, stops and starts are sometimes common with foreign assistance, and that OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, holds up dollars all the time, including in the past, dollars going to Ukraine. Ambassador Volker affirmed that aid gets held up from time to time for a whole assortment of reasons and explained that it's something that happened in his career in the past. So all of this ballyhoo about the president withholding aid to Ukraine is not an impeachable offense. There's no quid pro quo. And quite frankly, I would even argue, I don't think the president's lawyers point out, and I think rightfully so, that there never really was a quid pro quo. I'm arguing that even if there was a quid pro quo, I think that's entirely reasonable. And if that quid pro quo was, hey, we want you to assure us that you have cleaned up all of this corruption before you get aid for the American taxpayers, for American foreign policy, I think that is a legitimate quid pro quo. Now, I'm going to continue reading through the brief because it's just fascinating. And there are parts of it that I'll probably bring in the podcast later on this week. But I would just ask you to think about this. So as you're listening to this podcast, check around. Listen to news stories or talk shows or, Fox News or CNN, whatever you listen to, and see if these examples of foreign aid being withheld, those 5 examples that I gave you, where were the Democrats on those? Why didn't they impeach on those? Why the focus on Ukraine? You know why? Because they don't want the American people to find out about the corruption involving Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. Thanks for joining me today. Now be sure and drop me a line if you'd like to comment about the president's brief. You can find me on Twitter at Michael Brown USA. You can find me on Facebook, Michael D. Brown. And over on Facebook, you can also join the Facebook group that has to do with the podcast. You can follow the podcast at The Situation with Michael Brown on Instagram, LinkedIn, and caucusroom.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to The Situation with Michael Brown on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google, wherever you're listening right now. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating and a positive review. The Situation with Michael Brown is written by me and produced by Right Turn Media. Marketing and social media by Whole Crowd. Talk to you tomorrow.